And we are back for part two with Tania, but this time, Tania Vasallo. Is it Vasallo or is it Vasallo?
Vasallo in Spain. In
It
Italy,
is
it's
Vasallo.
Vasallo. It is an Italian last name, but in Spain we pronounce it with the Y, the
Vasallo.
two L's.
So, Tania, we did discuss this before, but our audience doesn't know. What we're going to talk about is something that mothers tend to experience, and that is what happens after childbirth. And the reason we're going to be talking about this is because I heard you on one of your you were interviewing someone else and you brought this up, and as soon as I heard what you were sharing, I said, Tania, I want you on my podcast. We need to talk about this because I don't see a lot of women sharing their personal experience when it comes to what it was like after having a child when it wasn't all rosy.
Yes, thank
So,
you.
so Tanya, what was your experience? I'm just going to leave it out. What was your experience? You only have one child?
Yes, I only have one daughter. And so my experience, I think, was first I had I had her later in life. I had her at 38, and I'd been with my husband for 12 years before we had a kid. So it wasn't like the typical, like, get married, have a kid, within a year or two or whatever. It was very different, like we traveled, we lived all over. And when I was like around 35, like it became clear to me that I wanted to become a mom. And I did get pregnant. I think within that first year that we made that decision, I got off birth control, I got pregnant, and I had a miscarriage. And so we were still living back in Spain. And here's another topic. No one talks about miscarriage. So very few people knew I was pregnant, just like my immediate family and a couple friends. And the moment I had a miscarriage, my mom tells me that my grandmother had 3 miscarriages before her. Then you start hearing, and then my aunt had a miscarriage, and so had a miscarriage. And it's so much more common than what people talk about. And here I am feeling super guilty because when I had that miscarriage, it was in the middle of a move, and I'm thinking, oh, I overdid it. My body didn't take, that's why I lost the baby, blah, blah, blah. And it was fine. I grieved that. I moved on, and we kept on trying, but nothing was happening. We weren't getting pregnant again. I wasn't getting pregnant. 1 year went by, 2 years went by, and I was going to the therapist at this point, and we were talking about this. Like, this came up a lot in therapy. It wasn't the main thing for why I was going, but she kept telling me and reassuring me that I would become a mom. And so I think it just almost became like an obsession, of like, I have to get pregnant. I have to get pregnant. But then my husband, on the other hand, would always say, well, if we have kids, great. And if we don't, I'm fine with it too. And so I started using the same phrase. I was like a little parrot, just mimicking what he was saying. But I don't think I really felt that deep down, because in the therapy sessions, what would come out is that I wanted to be a mom. Anyway, all of this happened in Spain while I was living in Spain. We moved back to the US in 2011, and I decided, I got pregnant in 2009, and it's 2011. I was like, okay, you know what? I started making friends with a lot of people that had already hit menopause years, didn't have kids, or the kids were already grown. So I was like, because what was happening too is, in that period that I was trying to get pregnant, all of my friends were getting pregnant. And so that is like the worst thing that can happen to someone that's trying to get pregnant, because you're happy for them, but deep down you're also jealous, and there's all kinds of emotions going on. So when I came to the US and I started making friends that have already passed this, there's no going back. I was like, you know what? Maybe these are just the cards that I was dealt. I'm just not meant to have kids. It's been 3 years. It hasn't happened. Let's just move on. And I remember very clearly, I was working at the photographic workshops, and this is a longer story, but I think it's very important to notice this of just like how much I wanted it. I wanted it so bad. And I met this interesting man. I'm not going to say his name because he's pretty well known. And he's a documentarist, and he had to do some portraits, and he starts asking me questions. Are you a mom? No. Why aren't you a mom? Like he's like very in his work role of asking questions. Well, I'm not a mom because I wasn't going to tell him about the miscarriage. I had just met him. So I'm like, no, well, if I have kids, I've been with my husband for this long. If I have them, great. If I don't have them, that's fine too. He's like, well, it surprises me. I've only known you a couple of days, but you seem like you'd be a great mom. Like he kept going and going until one point I just wanted to nip it in the butt. I was like, look, I had a miscarriage 3 years ago and I haven't gotten pregnant again. So I don't think that it's in the cards for me to become a mom. It's just like, I just wanted to put a stop to the conversation because I felt a little bit pushed in that direction. And he shared with me that his wife had one baby, and then she had 2 miscarriages after that. And I so appreciate him sharing that because it opened up a whole new world for me. And his wife is a famous actress, so for me to know of someone that was in that world, and that had gone through, again, it's this taboo of not talking about these subjects of like miscarriage, because if you hear of other people like, oh, I heard their story. Wow. Okay. So you can keep on trying. There is still hope. You can go through 3 miscarriages or whatever until you get your baby. What that did, it opened up the next day. I was just journaling. It opened up a whole can of worms. And I got really clear with myself that I really wanted to become a mom. It just came to me. And I even told him, I was like, I don't know how to present this to my husband because we've been together for 11 years. He says he doesn't care if we have kids, but I'm to the point that I want them no matter what. Like, even if I have to do IVF or anything else. And the reason why I didn't want to try IVF or anything else is because I had a belief, because the people that I knew, out of 9 or 10 people that I knew that had done IVF, all of them had separated after having kids. And the 2 that had remained in the relationship, it was a horrible relationship for them. So my belief was, if you're going to do IVF, it's going to put a strain on the relationship. You're going to have the kid or not. And if you do have the kids, you're going to end up separating. But after journaling with all this, I really became clear that I wanted to experience motherhood and that I wasn't trying hard enough. It's just weird, like schedule your sex time to have a baby, like it just doesn't work for me and my husband. That's why I think it didn't happen in those last 3 years, So anyway, I went to my husband and I told him, and I was willing to risk with him telling me that he didn't want kids, and then I would have to start over. That's how bad I wanted it. Or maybe I'd be a single mom and try IVF, or artificial insemination or whatever. But luckily my husband just looked at me, he hugged me, and he said, well, we'll give it a try, but I'm turning 40 next year. So I'm giving it 1 year, and you're in charge of looking at your ovulation and all those other things. Don't expect me. So here's the thing that I learned from that whole story. I was expecting my husband to beg me for a kid, like in the Disney has done such harm to women, I was expecting him to be like, I want a child from you, and that's how I wanted to conceive a baby. After that conversation, I got pregnant within the month. So I think there was a lot psychological. After all these 3 years, I think there was a lot energetically, there was just a lot that went on. So I get pregnant, I'm 38 at the time, and then my child is born. And you're thinking, I think I saw this as check off the list, check, I got married, check, I got the job, check, I made, I hit this milestone, check, I had the kid, I had the baby. Because let me tell you, I don't know if it was postpartum depression definitely was borderline, if not postpartum depression. Again, we don't talk about these things, but my hormones were all over the place. I'm a person that needs my 8 to 9 hours of sleep. I love sleeping, and that was stripped away from me. And it was hard. It was the toughest time during our relationship as a couple. Like I said, I've been with my husband for 12 years up to that moment. And we never really argued. We had several arguments after she was born. And I'll never forget too, I had a friend after I had my miscarriage the first time, I asked her, because I started asking everyone, like, if you could do it over again, would you have your child? Like, let's put aside that obviously you love your children are the best, you have a great relationship, you now know what it's like. Would you choose to have a child again? And out of the 4 or 5 people, almost everyone's like, yes, I love my kids, blah, blah. My sister-in-law was very honest. She's like, no, like, I love my kids to death, but I went through postpartum and it was really hard on me economically. It was hard on me. I had depression, like all these other things. She's like, I don't think I'd do it again. It was really, really hard. And this friend in particular said, I'll just say one thing, Tania, when you have a child, it brings the couple together. It unites you because you're creating something together out of love, but it also separates and it divides you. And that's how I felt the first couple years were with having a baby. And that's the part that no one talks about. And I told one of my sister-in-laws that has 4 kids, I'm like, this is like a cult. All of you guys, all the parents, meaning parents, are the cult, because they tell you like, oh yeah, you should have kids, bring kids into the world to be like them. And then when you have the kid and you're going through all this, sleepless nights, all the sacrifices, sacrifice of time, sacrifice of money, sacrifice of all these things, I'm like, why doesn't anyone talk about all that stuff? Like, it's just so freaking hard. And I so appreciate you bringing this up, Francesca, because we aren't talking enough about postpartum depression. We aren't talking enough about how hard and the strains it puts on a relationship, and that you better have a strong foundation. We still live in this Disney movie of the happily ever after. And we have this imagination and this utopia of how beautiful having children is. And honestly, I commend people that by choice decide not to have kids, that they have such strong understanding within them. Obviously, I love my child. And I don't know, to the question of like, would I choose to have children again? I don't know. I think I'm still in my grieving process of my life before children than my life with children. And obviously there's different phases that you enjoy. Babyhood was not my favorite phase. That's my mother-in-law loves babies and babyhood. I like them from like a little bit older than toddlers, like 4 to 7, maybe. That's like a good age. Now at 9, they're starting to get a little bit more, responsive with things. We'll see how teenage years go and so forth. But yeah, that was a long response, Francesca, but I thought it was important to carry us through everyone's particular situations, and just to be honest with ourselves as we're going through it.
Yeah, and I'm grateful that you gave the background of how badly you wanted this kid. So it wasn't like you didn't want the child, then you had the child. I think a lot of women, including myself, have had, I can't say that for you because you wanted a child, but when it came for me, I can speak from my own personal experience. I had a child because it was expected of me. It's like you get married, you have children. So I have to have a child, right? It wasn't because I was dying to have a child, but I didn't mind having a child. But then I had the child. And as soon as the child was born, people were like, when are you having the next one?
Oh, yes, yes.
And it was the most infuriating question that I found it so infuriating that people would ask me that, because like, I just had a child. What is this expectation of me having another child? And I think that maybe was that little the back of my mind, reacting to, I just had a child. That wasn't this, I only did this because it was
You
expected
expected
of
it.
me, right? It's not because I was dying to have a child. And like you said, I love my kid to bits, right? Like there's no doubt. Like I love her to
Mhm.
pieces. Had I known, though, going back like you, I don't know if I would have chosen to have a child, knowing what I know now. She also, I wanted to ask her before we go into my experience with this, because I don't want to digress from your experience. So you mentioned you weren't necessarily diagnosed with postpartum. And obviously, the things that come along with having a child, the financial stress, the sleep stress, the lack of sleep, and all that stuff, the lack of time, losing your independence of being able to do whatever you want at any time you want. What were the symptoms? What were the things that make you think that was postpartum depression or something related to it, in addition
Yes.
to those things that are just the common things?
Mhm. First off, she didn't, it was complicated with the breastfeeding. Here I did all this research about giving birth. So I never focused on breastfeeding. I just thought that was unnatural. Like you stick it onto the boob and the baby drinks its milk. Well, it is a much more complex world that I had no idea about. So I had to get a lactation consultant, which is someone that tells you how to put the baby on the breast, how the milk feeding, all this stuff. So I think there was a little bit of like it just, we didn't have that special bond that again you see in movies, and like how beautiful the baby just, oh, I just love it. No, my breasts were getting swollen. I was having, I can't even remember the name of it, like when the breasts, like they get so hard and it's so painful. So there's certain things with your body, that you're just like, I want my previous body back. I want to feel like I used to feel. Like I don't think I was prepared. Like I just didn't have the knowledge of the grieving, because maybe because we don't talk about this. We just talk about all the beautiful side of it. And all my research was about how to give birth at home. I wanted to give birth at home, and if possible, inside the water, which I wasn't able to do. I was able to give birth at home, but I had not researched all the stuff that comes afterwards, like the last trimester that they talk about, like once the baby's out of the womb. I didn't have all the support. My family was back in Spain, and my parents did come for the first 2 weeks, and then my mom stayed for an extra 2 weeks. But what happened was, luckily here in the US, people are very gracious. They set up the meal trains, and people were bringing me food that first week because my daughter came a week earlier, and my parents had a plane ticket for the estimated arrival. So that first week I was very taken care of by the community until my parents arrived. As soon as my parents arrived, everyone just kind of like, oh, okay, she's taken care of, her parents are here. But that wasn't really the case, because my mom got sick. She wasn't doing everything that I was needing at that time. Like I wish she was doing more laundry. I will say a wonderful gift that a friend of ours gave, Judy Newton. She paid our cleaning lady. We had the same cleaning lady. She paid 2 months of cleaning services for me. And that was an amazing gift. It's just like, where I missed out was on the support from community, from family. There's cultures that do 40 days of just the moms resting, and the culture, again, patriarchy, the beliefs that have been ingrained into us of just do, work, go, go, go. I think I had to fulfill this role of, you gave birth, and even though it was a 3-day labor, because I was in labor, my water broke on a Tuesday and she was not born until Thursday, midday. I was still expecting, let me host my parents and make them some tea, when it should have been the other way around, like they just gave it. I wish people would have told me that. And so symptoms that I noticed, I didn't want to hang out with the baby as much, like I was doing some of the things like, again, to check off the list, like, oh, you're supposed to have skin contact with the baby because that's what you're supposed to breastfeed for the first 6 months. Well, guess what? After the first month, my baby was like a little shark and I could not produce enough milk fast enough. But because I had to check off that list, again, the stigma in our culture, oh my God, if you don't breastfeed for 6 months at least, or for a year, that baby is going to have all sorts of problems. And so I was like, oh my God, I can't be the bad mom. So I was pumping milk and then feeding the baby for 6 months. I was doing this at the airport, traveling, just because of the stigma. When now looking back in hindsight, I was like, just get a freaking formula for the baby. It's not going to be the end of the world, because I checked off the box of I'm a good mom because I breastfed for 6 months and I made it be hard. Another big belief that I have, because we were talking about money beliefs, is you have to work hard to succeed and make money. So I had to work hard to be a successful mom. And so there were certain things that I wasn't listening to myself, like that, like, well, maybe breastfeeding is not my thing. And I wasn't strong enough to not care what everyone else thought. I wasn't strong enough to say, you know what, I'm not bonding with this baby as much. Like I almost saw my husband bonding more. Like it was almost like he was the mom and I was the dad, like there was a little bit of that disconnect with the baby. I remember one time driving all the way to the top of the ski basin here at the mountain with the baby and with my daughter in the back seat because she was crying. And I just called a friend that I knew with her second baby. She had postpartum depression. She had been diagnosed and she'd been taken care of. And I just called her and I was like, Amanda, what were your symptoms? Because I can't do this. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. I don't know if I can handle this. And I've handled a lot of hard things in my life, but I don't know if I can be a mom. And I don't know if I can be a good mom. Why am I not wanting to be with this baby all day? And then you'd go to mommy meetups, and especially with younger moms. Not saying that all younger moms don't go through postpartum, because it runs in the family too. I've had nieces and sister-in-laws that have had postpartum, but I wasn't feeling it. And honestly, now in hindsight, I wish I would have had someone to talk about this and that they would have been able to help me take the stigma off of it. Because I was like, oh, well, what if I do antidepressants for this? Then that's going to go into the breast milk and I'm supposed to be breastfeeding my child. And that's going to screw up my child for the rest of her life. Like the beliefs and the stories that we tell ourselves because of lack of information. There's so many things that I did wrong, that I wish I could have a do-over, and I'm not having a do-over because it's only one child that I got. But if you're listening and you can hear this, if you're feeling, yes, we all lack sleep. And it's true that when I lack sleep, if I have less than 6 hours, I'm a mess, with baby or without baby. It's happening to me now in perimenopause, like those insomnia nights. But it's there is a difference of lack of sleep crankiness and mood swings because they are hormonal, so just my advice, please surround yourself, have these conversations with other women. It really helped me having that conversation with my friend that had gone through it, because I didn't know who else. I couldn't talk to my mom. I didn't know. I'm like, she doesn't understand. The last time she had a baby was almost 40 years ago. She's not going to know. So surround yourself with other safe spaces or other women that might have gone through the same thing. And I love that you've shared, Francesca, too, that you had the baby because that's what was expected of you. And then on top of that, that people are expecting, because that runs deep in the culture too. And I wonder, I never really questioned it, if I also did it for those reasons, as kind of, like the first child, in my family, like the badge of honor to like, oh, she did that too. She got the good job. She married good. She had the baby. Really question that. because having a child requires sacrifice in every sense: sacrifice of time, sacrifice of money, sacrifice of love, sacrifice of your own, it's just of everything. Are you willing to do it? And what is on the other side? Or are you doing it because this is what's expected of us, or because of what society is expecting, or your religious background, or whatever, whoever's expecting it from you? Again, questioning our beliefs, going back to awareness. And I wish I would have gone through all of this beforehand.
Ask yourself why do you want this in the first place? If you're in that position that you're contemplating having children. Thank you for sharing all that. There's so much there. I have a similar but not the same kind of experience, and I think it's important to share that as well, where I didn't have time for postpartum. And I think it's so important that we're sharing this. Like you said, people don't talk about this. And if you don't have the right support, if you know what to expect, what potentially could happen, and you still want to go through it, then surround yourself with the right support. Prepare yourself in advance so that you're not blindsided. So I kind of had a similar experience as yours, Tanya, in the sense that I had no family around. That was one mark right there. Also didn't have friends. I was new to the city where I had moved at the time. And when she was born, my mom came. So she did come before the baby was born, but my daughter was born with extreme, severe, like if you could put it on a chart, is probably like at the 100% and above of the worst cases of colics.
Oh,
So she cried 24/7, sleeping only 10 minutes at a time every 2 hours, round the clock. There was no night, there was no day. It was round the clock, crying from the top of her lungs. And the only way I could keep her quiet was either by feeding her, right? And or by rocking her, by having her, I was holding her with my arm, with her bum sitting against my hip. So she was facing outward, and she was literally like folded over my arm. And I would be bouncing up and down, walking forward and back. It was the only way that I could calm the screaming, not stop. Just calm it to a little quieter kind of cry. And that's how I spent my night so that I wouldn't wake up the neighbors, because I lived in an apartment building at the time. So I was afraid that people would complain and get me kicked out of the place because she was screaming so loud all night long, every night. When my mom came, she didn't know what to do. Like there was no one that could help me. Like they didn't know what to do with her. There was no solution. And you can only feed so much. And trigger warning, trigger warning, telling you now, trigger warning. I breastfed so much to keep her quiet that my nipples cracked open and started bleeding. Where I couldn't breastfeed her anymore properly, but she wouldn't take the bottle. So you have the additional screaming and crying. So it was like a full nightmare, a full nightmare. And on top of that, my ex, her dad, he would go to work. He would come home, and then he would hold her so that I could cook for him.
Oh, God.
And then I'd get the kid back. He would have his dinner and do whatever he would normally do, just close himself in a room. And he slept in a different room because he had to go to work the next day. So I was there 24/7 with a screaming child. My mom was there for, I can't remember, maybe a couple of weeks, but she was like completely unable to help because she did not know what to do. She got completely stressed over it. Now, my ex-mother-in-law, who used to be a nurse, volunteered to travel and come over because I was telling her what was going on. She's like, "Oh, you do not worry. I'll come over. I'll spend a month with you. I will take care of the baby. You're going to be able to sleep. You're going to get all the rest. You're going to be fine." Great. She arrives. She takes the baby. She goes, "You go for a nap. I'll take care of her," because she was screaming all the time. And she could not get her to stop crying. She tried dipping the pacifier in sugar. She tried dipping the pacifier in honey. She tried everything to try to get this kid to take the pacifier. She wouldn't even take the pacifier. And this kid would not take it. My daughter would not take anything. She just wanted me. just me, like constantly, constantly, constantly. And then she left, my mother-in-law left. So then I was all by myself. And I was rocking her back and forth every single night. And guess what happened? What happens when you have lack of sleep? I collapsed with her in my arms in the middle of the night
Oh,
from weakness, from lack of sleep. I had not been able to sleep because I would put her to bed. As soon as she would fall asleep, I'd put her down. I lay myself down. As soon as I put my head down, it was like you could
oh,
time it. You could time it. I would not be able to sleep. So I had no support. So even though, um, like I said, I didn't have the time to be depressed because I was 100% taking care of a screaming kid, trying to keep her quiet because I didn't want to be kicked out of the building. So
that
that's
is
another scenario.
crazy.
That's another scenario, right? So be
It's
aware.
it's and especially because you don't know what you're gonna be given.
Yeah,
You know, like you don't know
yeah,
what kind of child is gonna be born, what your
yeah,
situation's gonna be, how your hormones are gonna play throughout the whole thing, how your delivery. I mean, to me, my biggest request is for women to start talking more about these things. And the second biggest one that I learned, after giving birth is to stop judging, like this whole judging, whether you give birth at home or you give birth at the hospital. Did you have a C-section? Did you do a vaginal birth? Did you do, did you breastfeed? Did you give them formula? You don't know the situation of each mom. Like, like I could have been there. Like if I didn't have kids, I could have been easily saying to Francesca or in that building, like, oh my God, quiet that baby. That baby is just like, what are you doing? You don't know what you're doing as a mom. When the baby had a colic, and yes, she doesn't know what she's doing because no one does, neither can you try pacifying this child, like it's just not going to happen. So it just, leave the judgments to side. It definitely taught me that, if just stop judging everyone, including myself, like, so what that, I'm not the hero and I wasn't able to breastfeed her for 2 years. It's like, that's the child, that's the situation I got
yeah,
dealt. Other
yeah,
women have to give, birth, and they're traumatized because they ended up doing a C-section when they wanted to do a vaginal birth. So to me, it's like, don't judge other women. Don't judge women if they're taking antidepressants during postpartum, or if they're not, or whatever they need to survive. Because until you don't walk in that woman's shoes, you have no idea what it is like. We can
yeah,
judge all day long.
yeah,
And yeah, and I
yeah,
hope that we can start talking more about these subjects, about miscarriages, about our deliveries, our birth stories, the postpartum, how are we doing as moms? Talk about, now I'm in the phase of perimenopause. Like that's like my whole intrigue, because we don't talk about it enough. And a lot of doctors aren't even aware of a lot of these things, like hormones and what kind of hormones to, help women with. So I'm so glad that you're having these kind of conversations, Francesca. They're so needed.
yeah. And nothing prepares for you. Prepares you for some of the extreme cases. Like in my case, it was extreme. Natasha she was colicky for 6 months. It took six
Oof.
months before she had her first 2-hour block of sleep.
Wow.
And it started in the morning. So she fell asleep in the morning. And then the following day, she slept a little bit longer. But instead of falling asleep earlier, she was falling asleep a little later. And we went through that whole cycle until she eventually ended up falling asleep at night.
Oh
But
my
it
God.
took over 6 months before I could have a full night's sleep. Like if you saw photos of me, the bags under my eyes, it was like somebody went in there with a shovel and carved them out of my head. It was
Oh
just
my
absolutely horrible.
goodness.
And I was going to doctors too. That's the thing. If somebody's wondering, why did you bring her to the doctor? She was screaming like that. I would bring her to the pediatrician and say, she's fine. They would hear she's fine. She's growing healthy. There's nothing wrong with her. Colics is normal. I'm like, yeah, but this is not normal. It's not normal for me not to be able to sleep. If I'm the mom, I'm supposed to be able to take care of her, and I can't take care of her fully the way you say, like in the
She's
in the Disney, in the Disney movies, But then there was also someone else that I knew who had a baby at the same time. Like I think we were only like a week or two apart. Her baby slept all day long and all night long. It was just like
Oh.
the perfect baby, right? So it's not all bad. Okay. So we're here, we're sharing our stories and our personal experience, but we don't want to scare people, saying that every child is going to bring these kind of challenges. There are children that are born that are super quiet, like the perfect child of the Disney, model of what a
Mm-hmm.
baby is like. What we're here to say is be aware. Just be aware that it may turn out in more than just one way. And if you're not prepared, it can be extremely challenging, and it really does take a toll on your physical health and on your emotional health, and it does take a toll on your relationship too. So yeah, all of that. I I so appreciate you being willing to share your experience, because like I said, you only mentioned a little clip of your experience at this other interview you were doing, and I really caught on that. I'm like, no, we need to talk about this. This is important. This is so important.
It is. I'm glad that you brought it up. And I believe it was Valerie that I was interviewing. And it would be interesting to have a conversation with her too, because I know she's struggling. Her child is 2.5 years old. You know what? It was interesting to me with realizing with the postpartum. It wasn't until my daughter must have been 5 years old. I got invited to a talk about grieving. And I was like, well, it was towards the end of the year, like November or something. And I really liked this speaker. And I was like, well, I'll go to the talk just to listen to her to see how she speaks. Not because I am grieving anyone, in particular, but let me just go as a trainer, put on my trainer hat and listen. And the first thing that she starts saying at this talk, she's like, well, grieving comes in so many shapes and forms. It's not just losing a loved one or losing a pet. Grieving can be grieving, your economic status, how maybe you had to file for bankruptcy. Maybe you're grieving your health, maybe you had some health condition and you're grieving your life before your health condition. And as she's going and giving examples, she's like, there's over 100 different types of grievings. And so I'm like, it just came to me. I said, my daughter was 5. I started bawling. And the reason was because I think I never had space to grieve my life before being a mom. I was just thrown into this. And like you said, you don't have time to think about it. You just have to keep going. You go with emotions. Your work comes up. She's growing. Da, da, da. You're doing everything you have to do as a mom. So there was never time carved out. And maybe that was part of the postpartum that just dragged throughout those years, because I never grieved my life, my independent life, to get to do whatever you want, whenever you want, before being a mom, until that moment that I was like, oh, okay. Now it took me 5 years to realize that my life is now different as a mom, even though you hear it by everyone and everyone's like, oh, everything's going to change. Yeah, I know. But I was in such motion and doing, going, that I never allocated that space to just be with myself. And you can do that. I really highly suggest that women do this, but you can only do it if you have support, or if you have a super peaceful baby, and that you can maybe journal throughout this time, and you can get your sleep, and it's a different experience of motherhood when you can really kind of analyze all of that and go through it, versus having it hit you in the face 5 years later, like in my case. But like you said, Francesca, I think every child is a world, every relationship's a world, and just be prepared and definitely look for support and know that you're not on your own. Listen to these type of conversations, reach out for help. If you don't have family there, reach out for different groups that might be able to help you out.
Yeah. One thing that I knew before I had my child, one thing that I knew for sure was that I didn't want any more than one.
Ooh, you were clear.
I was clear on that. And I tell you why. Because I had been a nanny and I had 4 children I was looking after. Right, the oldest was 7 and the youngest was a newborn when I first started working there. And I got a clear idea that I
Picture.
didn't want any more than one. If I'm going to have I'll have the child, but I won't have any more than one. So when people would ask me, when are you having the next one? My answer would be, well, I'm just going to worry about this one for now and just leave it at
That's good.
that, right? Because it's like, I hated that question.
And honestly, I think it's a rude question. I think it's
Very
a
rude
rude
question.
question to ask people, are you having kids just because you're married? And I think it's a rude question to ask after you've had one kid, when are you having another one? Because again, it's just feeding into these expectations of society, of families. And it's actually a little bit selfish if it comes from family members, in my opinion, like from the grandparents or from the aunts or uncles or whatever. It's like, well, you just want me or whoever to have more babies so that you can be like, oh, I have more grandchildren or I have more nieces and nephews or whatever. But are you really there in the day to day, caretaking of all of it too? Anyway, just be careful with how you pose those questions around kids because you never know people's stories. You never know if they've gone through miscarriages, if they've been trying, through IVF, if they've made a choice that they don't want to have kids and they
Yeah.
don't have to give you an explanation with that.
Yeah.
That's a total valid choice too.
Yeah. Also, you were talking earlier about a man who was asking you questions, and then in the end, he ended up helping you by sharing the story of his wife. However, the questions he was asking you, I didn't want to interrupt you then, but I'm going to bring it up because the questions he was asking you were totally inappropriate because he would have never asked a man those questions he was asking you.
It was interesting. Yes, you're right. But I have to put it into context just to his defense because we were in a photography class. He had it, I was his subject, and the whole assignment was to capture the person's soul, in the photograph. And so, in order to do that, as a good documentarist, like he specializes in documentary films. He knew what questions to ask. I've seen his documentary films. He knows what questions to ask to pull out that essence. And actually, at one point, as he was sharing these stories, and he shared about his wife having had 2 miscarriages and that she almost had a pill to abort the last child because she had this big job, this big gig that came in, and she didn't want to go through that situation again. He was telling me that and I started tearing up. But we were walking together, so he didn't even notice that I was crying, that I was all emotional. And I just remember bumping him with my elbow and saying, hey, you can take the photo if you want to right now. Like I gave him permission to take a photo of me and the midst of the emotional moment. So yes, they were inappropriate if it's taken out of context, but because of the assignment and the background of it, and his background, I mean, I don't know, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. And I'm thankful that it happened the way it did. And, now after, because if he wouldn't have asked all those questions, I might have kept on going in my life and I wouldn't have a child right now, like it wouldn't have opened up that whole world. But yes, I'm funny that you're bringing that up,
Yeah.
Francesca.
Well,
Good point.
context,
Thank you.
context, right? Context
Yes.
matters too, right? So
Yes.
I was missing that piece. So in that sense, I get it. I get it. Well, Tania, thank you so much for being so open and sharing such vulnerable aspects of motherhood and the whole experience around that. So hopefully our listeners are getting something from this, even if you're not a mom, if you don't intend to be a mom, then you can be supportive to someone who may be a new mom or may end up being a new mom who may find herself in that sort of situation. Hopefully we are sharing information that gives you some insights on how you can help and support someone who may be struggling after giving birth. They may be
Thank you,
alone.
Francesca.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm very grateful. I know this is not the field that you know, that's not your business. It's not your business. It's not how you make a living, but this was so important. But I do want to give everybody your website because it's fitting. TheCourageToBeHappy.com. It's so fitting. So fitting. So if you didn't catch the episode we did before with Tania, we talked about finances and money mindset, the importance of that. And yeah, so any last words before we go, Tania, that
I
you
just
want to share?
first I want to say thank you to you for the work you're putting out there and for having these conversations, even if they're hard and it's vulnerable. But the more we can share in our vulnerability, the more we can grow as women and as a society and a community. And for any women out there, just reach out, find support. If you are becoming a mom, if you're choosing not to be a mom, that's fine too. Like just whatever, just tune in with yourself. So thank you, Francesca, again. Thank you.
Thank you.